excited to welcome Lee to the podium tonight to celebrate with him the imminent publication of his book, Reflections on Globalization, Democracy, and the Media. As we know, in any democracy, one of the pillars of that form of government rests upon the inevitably isometric, the pushing against, relationship between the branches of government and a free press. We hear from the leader of governments the term fake news, and I say governments because we're hearing it around the world now, the term fake news daily these days, along with everything that this implies, and Lee's book contextualizes and sheds light on how new media technologies and social upheaval have made for similar tensions in the past, not just now, but before. Who better to take us through this fascinating topic than Lee Huebner, who's been grappling with issues of politics and the media for decades. While Lee was pursuing his master's and doctorate in history at Harvard, he and his fellow students founded the Ripon Society, a political research organization. This led to his position, this is the one he's best known for, I think, as Special Assistant to the President of the United States and Deputy Director of the White House Writing and Research Staff during the Nixon administration. That means he wrote Nixon's speeches. Lee served for 14 years as publisher and CEO of the Paris-based International Herald Tribune, now known as the International New York Times. During this time, the IHT became the world's first newspaper with a broad global presence. Lee, and it was just after that that you came to us to be our president in the mid-90s. Lee taught for 12 years in the schools of communication and journalism at Northwestern, which is his alma mater, and is now the Early Professor of Media and Public Affairs at GW, at George Washington University, after serving as that school's director for 3 years. He chairs the Center for the Study of International Communications in Paris and has also chaired the American Chamber of Commerce here, as well as the European Council of American Chambers of Commerce. He's been a board member for media companies in Hong Kong and East Africa, and presently works in a consulting role for the Aga Khan Foundation, the Aga Khan Fund for Economic Development, and the Aga Khan University. At AUP, we remember Lee's perhaps most impactful presidential act as that of founding Global Communications and hiring Waddick Doyle to run it. Lee's vision of our university's need to include teaching and research in that discipline, and his partnership with Waddick to breathe life, fast life, into it, resulted in one of our largest departments and most successful master's programs. Indeed, the only one so far to have received French recognition, and we're still in the process of celebrating the French professional recognition that Magic has recently received. In 2011, I had the honor of giving Lee the AUP Presidential Medal of Honor for Distinguished Achievement at graduation. He and his extraordinary wife, Berna, who's here, there's Berna, have also through CC, this is the organization they run in Paris, sent to AUP generations of students from Kenya, Cambodia, Vietnam, Syria, Uganda, Macedonia, other ones from, I think, Eastern Europe, countless other countries, most of these students both past and future students of journalism. And I owe myself many debts to Lee and his wife Berna, but one in particular was infinitely precious. His tremendous support for me. It was the first major international conference that I staged at AUP a few years after I got here. It was at the Chateau of Blois, and it was called Women in Power in the French Renaissance. So that was 1995, and the rest is history. Thank you, Lee and Berna, for that. Lee will accept questions after his talk tonight, and we hope that you will stay. We have a beautiful cocktail for you afterward, and he's hoping for lively conversation and lots of questions. Lee, we're thrilled to have you here.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful. I'm looking forward to those cocktails after too. Celeste says it's a wonderful introduction, even though it's exaggerated in many ways. I think David McGovern agrees, though, that the phrase longest serving is a better one than some others that might be used in our background. I also have to clarify that among the things I wrote was not the line, "I am not a crook." It's wonderful to see so many old friends and new friends here tonight. And it means a lot that you're here, even though it's a little bit intimidating. This is all triggered by the publication, in quotes, of this book. And actually, there is a book. This is what it looks like, just prove that there is one. And it came about in kind of an unusual way. There's a new experimental publishing house called Cognella on the West Coast, and they came to me and said they could do this. They specialize in books for university classes, and they make them available rather inexpensively as books go these days. And they also let the writer do it in stages. So this book's gone through a couple of stages. The first one was called, was a thin little version, 100 pages, preliminary edition. This one is called, believe it or not, the second revised preliminary edition. So it's still preliminary, and the thing that's missing are the footnotes and the academic apparatus that makes it more credible in some people's eyes. And I'm working on that now, and then it will be marketed and probably available. For now, it's available only through the publisher's student bookstore. People have to identify themselves as a George Washington student. You don't have to prove it, but that's how you get at it. Then you have to look at the course, and you find the book listed. I did bring an extra copy along that we decided last night as we talked should go to the AUP library, so it'll be there for those who are desperate to see it. Or let me know if you really want to see it, and we could arrange that. Let's see, the first part of this book, I just mentioned quickly, is based on lectures I've given in classes through all these years, beginning with a course I actually taught here 1 year on international communications, comparative media systems, I think it was, and some of that made its way into this. The second part of the book, the last 2/3, is really my own doctoral dissertation, actually, which really does go back a ways, but of course I've updated that and tried to make it relevant to the contemporary scene. The title of the dissertation back then was The Discovery of Propaganda, and it was a study of how that fascinating word propaganda first came into common usage in America, but around the world, and how it completely discombobulated the political world at that time, which is something I think is sort of echoed by the fake news crisis of today. That's sort of a parallel I tried to draw. I began that part of the book by telling a story about Teddy Roosevelt, which some of you may know. It was June 8th, 1898. He was just 40 years old. He was a colorful young politician known as the hyperactive police superintendent in New York. And the Spanish-American War, with his ardent support, had just begun, and he decided to raise a military regiment to go off and fight in Cuba. And the regiment was made up of what he called the Rough Riders. These were the people he had met when he lived for a while on the western frontier, the wild western frontier. And these people had come from all over the West and gathered on the docks in Tampa, Florida, believe it or not, and to go off to Cuba. And they brought their horses with them, but it turned out there were too few ships, too many men, and too many horses. And Roosevelt was painfully telling a lot of them they couldn't go, or they couldn't bring their horses along. Only officers finally could bring their horses. And he was walking along, sorting all this out, and two men came up to him, and he asked what they were doing, and they said, "Oh, we're from the Vitaphone Motion Picture Company, and we're here with Mr. Thomas Edison's new invention, the motion picture camera, and we'd like to take pictures of the war." And in all this chaos, Teddy Roosevelt said, "Welcome aboard." And that was the moment, I think, when the 20th century, in terms of political media history, really began. The melding of the new power of mass media with political ambition. And Roosevelt went on from that moment to really make the most of his own insight into what would make politics work, for him at least. He was the first, films of him charging up San Juan Hill, hear about that famous moment, were seen and publicized. And within 5 months, he was elected governor of New York. He was a national hero. He became vice president of the United States within another 2 years, and a year after that, of course, he was president of the United States. And he then became the first president to create a press room in the White House, the first president to actually give regular press conferences, you can see the pattern here, to campaign in person, retail politics, we think of it as, it all began. He made some 480 campaign appearances in 28 states in 1900 alone, and that's just sort of unheard of. He really changed the way politics was done and the way people thought about political leadership. And the word he used all through this, I race along here, conscious of the fact that we have only an hour and a half until the drinks are sort of. And I must say, among the people who helped me get this done was my wife, Berna, who Celeste already mentioned. I told her, she was advising me both on the book and on this talk, and was very concerned that I would talk too long. So she's in charge of cutting me off at whatever point seems appropriate, which may come sooner than we think, I'm not sure. At any rate, as I race through some of this background, the key word here is the word publicity. And Roosevelt saw it as the great cure, the great antiseptic. If you shine the light of publicity on public affairs, then things will start to go well. We can really trust the public to respond well if you publicize things. It was like an antiseptic, was the metaphor he used. Other people thought that this new media, propaganda was the word they used, was more like a new plague of germs that were infesting the air, and that metaphor got used an awful lot in those years as well. Roosevelt was joined in this enthusiasm for the arts of publicity. Pitiless publicity was the way some people talk, by a lot of other reformers, you know, about the famous muckrakers. Doris Kearns Goodwin has written this wonderful book about Teddy Roosevelt and the journalists who joined with him in campaigns to really reform what they saw as the major problems facing society at that time. It's called The Bully Pulpit, that book, and that's a good metaphor to keep in mind as well. But a lot of other people were doing this, reformers of all sorts. The whole Christmas seal campaign began out of this passion. The YMCA, the community chest, all in the same very short period of time, as people realized they could rouse the masses in support of good projects. And of course, the religious evangelists took this up with a special passion. Billy Sunday was a famous person of that era, who was often cited by others as a model of the Teddy Roosevelt kind of public campaigning. And it was fascinating to read more about him, and some of that stories also in this book. At the same time, however, a kind of counter movement was settling in. Put this away. And that counter movement was business leaders deciding that they had to fight back in some way and improve their image and justify some of the things they were doing. The prevailing thought in the old world of the robber barons, as they were called, prevailing thought was that the public, how did Cornelius Vanderbilt put it, the public be damned, he would always say, when urged to explain himself. And I think that view had a lot of followers at that time. But other people came along to try to convince the business community that they ought to be using the arts of publicity in their own defense, in their own cause. And so people on both sides were calling on the public to respond to their publicity, but describing the other side as misusing those tools. And that's where the word propaganda came from. It's just propaganda. That's only fake news. Very much the same reaction. In fact, we heard the fake news comment today from the President of the United States when he was suggested, what was it, that he had tried to fire the special counsel way back last spring, and his one response at Davos, I guess, was, fake news, folks, it's fake news. It's just kind of a reflexive response. And that was happening 100 years ago a lot, except they used the word propaganda. This term propaganda was kind of fun to pronounce, and it was new. And to the extent it was known, it had an honorable connotation. It was the fancy Latin term that described the foreign mission arm of the Roman Catholic Church, the College of Propaganda, ever since the Counter-Reformation. And it took its name from propagating the faith. And of course, the old Roman word was to propagate crops, so there's a sense of nurturing things that are growing. And suddenly then, these honorable meanings were really lost. And gradually it became a curse word for many, a pejorative term, designating the use of public communication for dangerous ends. And what I learned in starting to study all this, even over many years ago I started, was how widespread the panic became. It was a propaganda panic. Many people used that term. People were scared to death that they suddenly couldn't trust the information they were getting. They didn't know where to turn. They didn't know what was true. Dangerous people could get mass support by seducing, that word was used a lot, seducing mass audiences. And this was scary, and people had to somehow try to come to terms with it. I should make a couple of points clear, I guess. One is that in the book, I don't talk about how they did the propaganda. People have been doing that since the beginning of time. But I talk about this new awareness that kind of threatened the premises of a democratic society. I think the premise that lies behind this in a kind of theoretical sense, and I know there are people here who study these questions at much greater length, but with much greater sophistication. But it was sort of this concept that really throughout the ages, most political power rested on the force of coercion. Coercion was the magic word. You forced people to do things through your physical strength. Back in cave world days, it was who was the biggest and strongest, and then that evolved into who had the most money, or who had the most allies, or the biggest military force. But it was coercion that kind of determined the flow of political history. And then there was this hope that began to spring up, early in ancient Greece, for example, that maybe, and Richard talked about this last night, for those of you who were here, maybe there was a sense of the common good that could be pursued by governing through consent, the consent of the governed, I should say. Consent of the governed is a phrase in the Declaration of Independence. It's a huge value. And so there was this sort of sense of these opposing forces, coercion on one side and consent on the other. And that was sort of the way the battle was framed. The tensions were argued and maybe resolved. And there was a sense that maybe the consent side was growing over time, especially as democracies began to succeed in North America and in Europe. It was kind of an inspiring hope. I would say a hope is the real word. And the phrase that came into use a bit by the real optimists and idealists was the old Latin phrase, vox populi vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. They didn't believe that literally, but it was kind of a message that this is how we ought to orient our governing processes. And all that came crashing down, I would say, in the early 20th century. People didn't say that anymore. It was too difficult to believe that in the light of what so many propagandists were appearing to do. In short, what they discovered, and you can see why this is shocking, what they discovered was that consent itself could be coerced. You could make people believe something. You didn't have to coerce them with force. You coerced them by using words as your instruments. Words could be weaponized, to use a phrase we hear a lot these days, and was in many ways. It suddenly seemed possible that those two opposites, that division would melt away and that consent would have to yield to the new powers, possibilities of coercion. And it's not just that people were falling for the fake stories, I think. I think it went one step further, and I think it's especially true today. The notion that people could be faked out, could be fooled, could be duped. It's not that people were duped, it's that they began to doubt even what was true was effective and important. They began to lose faith in all public information. They began to become very cynical and skeptical about the way the world worked. And that, as much as anything, continues to be a real threat, I think, to democratic processes. We read everywhere today about the post-fact society, and Celeste mentioned some of this, the post-truth society. I don't know whether you saw last week, the Rand Corporation published a book with the wonderful title, Truth, Decay. And that sort of expresses a lot. They even had a couple pages on the history of this, but not enough to steal the market from my analysis. In fact, I just read also over the weekend that both the government of France, I think, and of England the parliaments have now, I see a couple people nodding, that makes me feel good, have now created committees to study the fake news problem and how you can control it. And of course, on the other side, people are saying, well, do we want the government deciding what's fake and what's not? And does that sound like the Ministry of Truth in Orwell's novel in 1984? And the answer to this is puzzling and hard to find. I surely don't have it. It's this fake news mentality, I guess, in sum, that I would say that we should be thinking more about. not just because propaganda can spread lies, false information, but it can discredit true information, and that's being done all around the world, as Celeste said. This worries our journalism majors at George Washington, where I teach. They're going into a world where they're not sure their credibility won't be compromised and even fatally compromised in a way, or even made much less useful because people won't believe what they write and find. In this world, just to add a comment which fits in with some of the things we talked about last night, not knowing who to trust, I think people inevitably wind up simplifying the problem. They decide in advance what team they're on. They follow their leader. It's what some people call identity politics. It's much easier than listening and thinking things through. And it's not really new either. I always am reminded that you go back to the 10 Commandments. One of those 10 Commandments is thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. And clearly that was a problem in ancient societies and something leaders worried about. And that's not a new thing in human history. But what is new is the sense that it can be potentially so widespread. There's a new book called Bunk, I don't know if you've seen that, which traces human gullibility through history. Builds around P.T. Barnum's quote, very famous circus man from the 19th century, there's a sucker born every minute. And so fooling the public is really nothing new. But the omnipresent obsession, the propaganda panic, that was new, beginning around the year 1900. I have a quotation in the book that these pages are slipping and sliding a bit, but I think I can find it. It kind of expresses this. There are a lot of quotations in the book, and I've tried to select just a few that kind of give verification to. Today, it's an editorial in the New Republic magazine in 1915. This was the new hot, big public affairs magazine of the time, which said, "Today we allow public opinion to grow up like a slum child, unintended, disregarded, the victim of every money-seeking adventure. We permit it to be turned against itself. We are misled with false news, published for profit. What we need is not censorship, but a positive antibody against falsehood and stupidity. We need some means of educating the adult mind, perhaps some public defender of the truth," which seems like a pretty realistic plea, but pretty unrealistic formula for addressing this problem, and I think that continues to be the case today. There's a favorite quote I'm going to cite here too from an American philosopher, Suzanne Langer, many of you have read and know about. She once said that we only see things we have names for. And I think in this case, the word propaganda, just like the term fake news, allowed us to identify something that we now had a name for. And once we have a name for it, we tend to see it everywhere. People then talked about propaganditis, about living in a spooky haunted house. James Conant, the president of Harvard, famously said, "Look, I get up in the morning and say I'm going to defend myself against propaganda, and I go to bed every night realizing I have not been able to do that." And that echoed through the corridors of the intellectual world. You know the poet Carl Sandburg? This is ironic because he wrote a book, I'm going to quote part of it if I get the right page, a poem called "The People, Yes." It was this great, exuberant embrace of the democratic idea. But listen to one stanza in Sandburg's poem. "Always the storm of propaganda blows. Buy a paper, read a book, start the radio. Listen in the railroad car, in the bus, go to church, go to a movie, go to a saloon. And always the breezes of opinion are blowing. Mixed with the doctrines of propaganda and the chatter of selling spiels, the storm of propaganda blows everything away, always. In every air, the germs float and hover." Well, that's a pretty strong statement, and it didn't come out of nowhere. It really reflected a mentality at that time. So, as Celeste was saying, this thing we sometimes fear today is not all that new. John Dewey was one of the most famous philosophers of the early 20th century. He threw up his hands and said, "Look, we're lost in a flood of mass suggestion. Opinion can be manufactured for almost everything." And that was a kind of thoughtful consideration, I thought. And the cynicism grew and grew, and some of it became pretty extreme. You may know about H.L. Mencken, who kind of was considered to be a humorous, satirical columnist of a very serious bite. And his quote summed it all up, I think in 1920. Democracy, he said, is nothing more than a pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of individual arrogance. Pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of individual arrogance. Individuals may all be individual ignorance. They may all be ignorant, but somehow collectively we would do wise things. And I think that fell on receptive ears in a lot of places. So this is what I studied at that time. My professors said I should publish it, which was nice of them. My career wound up going in different directions. But as this whole problem recurred in the last few years, it seemed worth putting some of this into print, and the fact that it's the 100th anniversary of the First World War was another incentive, because in the end, World War I was pretty central to this whole story, to the loss of faith in government and in public communication. I keep going back to ancient Greece to talk about this because these issues did percolate a bit then. Broadening public discussion, finding the common good was going to be easier if you shared the decision-making process with more people. They tended to call it democracy. It was limited to men of property, not women, not the poor, not slaves. It was a very limited democracy, but not so different from the way France and the United States practiced democracy for decades, even in the modern era. But it was pretty hopeful that maybe the people, if consulted more, could help make better decisions in the interest of pursuing the common good. Plato, of course, worried about this. He thought you get too many people into the act, things aren't going to go well. And then he famously said, the next step after democracy, when democracy goes too far, is tyranny. And that's been a kind of scary reminder through the ages of what unqualified, excessive democracy, it sounds pretty elitist, and is, but it can lead to tyranny, Plato thought, and of course there were a lot of examples in the ancient world of where that had happened. A vulnerable, poorly informed people could easily fall for false rulers, and he preferred the rule, as you know, of what he called the philosopher kings, wise leaders who would, from an elite position, govern in the public, in what they hoped was the public interest. Aristotle wrote a lot about this too, of course. Some of you know all this much better than I do, but what struck me is that he said, well, you know, if you're going to have this democracy, it has to be a place where people can talk to one another, and look one another in the eye, and react to things cooperatively on the basis of intimate knowledge of one another. And that's why he said, and I think it's worth remembering today, democracy cannot work except within the range of the town crier's voice. It was really a local potential. And a lot of people are wondering if today that isn't part of the answer by the huge movement to have more reform and progress and justice focus on city governments, for example, where you're within the sound of a town crier's voice. It's pretty striking, I've talked with some of you about this informally, how unromantic the American founding fathers were about all of this. There was no voice of people, voice of God in their rhetoric. In fact, James Madison, I think was the father of the Constitution, was deeply afraid that democracy would be ruled by what he called the rabble. And Hamilton said, the people are a great beast. There was this real fear of what the irrational public could do. And they protected against it. They divided power between the states and the federal government. They divided power among the three branches of government. They set up an electoral college where public-spirited elites would be elected not by the people, but by the state legislatures. And they were there to protect the presidential selection process against some odd thing happening to happen because of popular elections. Some of those things worked better than some other things at the time. And this concern about the excesses of democracy continued to be felt. One of the speeches that I think is most fascinating in all of this and I think I remember this well enough to not read too many of my notes. Well, it came about, I think it's exactly 180 years ago this weekend. In Springfield, Illinois, a young lawyer, 28 years old, named Abraham Lincoln, gave the Lyceum speech, which was his first noted public speech. And what he worried about at that moment was the mob, what he called the mob. There had been riots over various topics in the Middle West and other places, and what he warned about was that the revolutionary generation, the great heroes now being gone, some tyrannically minded demagogue, I use that word, would come along and use this mob spirit to take power, and that the nation had to remember not to forfeit itself to that kind of possibility. And it was pretty striking. It didn't mean that Lincoln had lost confidence in the public. After all, he was the one who famously said that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. But he also thought long and hard about this ability to fool the people and to find unjust and not very happy responses to the search for the public good. And so he famously said, I just love playing with his words, you know, he said, you can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all the time, but he took great comfort from the fact that you can't fool all the people all the time, and that's why democracy still could work. Well, great. Except think about that. When all is said and done, if you can fool some people all the time, and all the people some of the time, there's a good chance there'll be some pretty foolish gatherings of foolish people along the way. And they don't have to coalesce for very long. It could be a year or a month or even a weekend. But if that many people can be fooled, well, then maybe there is a chance for democracy to go off the tracks. And I think that's what people got scared by in the early 20th century. The proposition now was, well, you can fool enough of the people, enough of the time. And that's what the question of propaganda addressed itself to. Now, I want to look at my watch again and see somewhere, how far along am I? I'm going to try to coordinate this. I have my pocket.
Looks 40.
Okay, I think we're okay. I think we'll get out here and still have time for a drink. They talked about this new poison in the air, I mentioned that. And then, of course, along came the First World War. And as it dawned, how just awful that stalemated trench warfare oriented struggle was been and how it was going nowhere. People wondered how they had gotten fooled into supporting this and how the rest of the world had suddenly been engulfed in its terrible consequences. And then in the 20s, when the consequences became even clearer, nothing really settled. Communism now entrenched in Russia, Nazism on its way in Germany, the Second World War clearly coming along. Well, then there was a tendency to blame it on propaganda. It became a simplistic answer, probably, but one that was quite popular. And then it was used to explain Lenin, and to explain Stalin, to explain Hitler, and to explain demagogues at home. Huey Long was a great example in Louisiana in the 1920s and 30s. And others used it to explain Berlusconi, fairly or unfairly, or Joe McCarthy, or George Wallace, all populist figures using media to almost drown out some of their opponents and to get some kinds of power. And of course, now recently, as we heard last night, it was part of how people explained the Brexit election. And others tried to explain what happened in the American elections. And then there were the fears in the Netherlands and Hungary and Poland and other places about a rising tide of authoritarian populist sentiment. And of course, the National Front helped people express some of this fear in the French context. I think the French election last May gave us a bit of a respite from that, at least for a while. It was a happy day in my judgment, but those gathering clouds of loss of public confidence, I think, in the democratic process, I think are still hover above us. If we talk about truth decay in a post-fact society, a post-truth society, then I think, and this will be the second half of these remarks, that it's useful to try to explain the conditions under which this starts. And I identified two big processes, two variables. Each one gets a chapter in this book. And the first one is social development, social realities that I've come to call the new processes of distension. That's not a familiar word. It's one that I found very useful. I had a professor at Northwestern University, Robert Wiebe, who wrote a book in which he put distension at the center of what was happening in America in the early years of the 20th century. What it simply meant was the world got too big, got too complicated, too widely scattered. The significant forces in our lives were stretched out to remote places beyond our understanding or control. I think the way to think about the word distension is to think of the word extension and then combine it with the word distortion. And then you get a distorted extension, which I found it fun to call distension, as my own professor had done. There's a great British sociologist who wrote a book called The Great Society in 1913. It was read everywhere. And the writer, Graham Wallas, didn't mean great in a good sense. He just meant great in a big sense. It's the Great Society. And he saw it as a real challenge to old ways of thinking. Another writer called it the Big Society, but it meant the dilution of traditional local small town communities where maybe, as Aristotle said, an intimate gathering of wise people could still pursue the common good. In the age of distension, the town crier's voice could not reach farther. Simply put, as somebody just summed it up by saying, the problem is there's no good way to check out the accuracy of the messages we're receiving. Even if they sound plausible, we have no way of checking. How do you check? Who do you believe? And I think that the power of the message is no longer dependent on its accuracy, but on other appeals. And that, I think, is the central problem. We're delocalized, another writer said. And a German writer noticed all of this and summed it up pretty shrewdly in the 1920s. He attributed the power of propaganda to the public's inability to keep up with social extension. Right on the mark. You're guessing his name, that was Adolf Hitler. And he really saw all this happening. It's kind of spooky to discover this. Of course, mass media was the cause of the problem in some people's eyes, but other people said, no, this is the answer. We just have to use mass media to replicate the old town crier's voice and inform people well enough that we can fight back against this. And it was pretty an amazing set of changes in mass media that had come about. If you had invited somebody in 1910 or 1915 or 1920, they were using communication tools that parents and grandparents hadn't even thought about. They had the new telegraph and the new telephone system. You could add them up. Bigger newspapers assembling mass audiences with new high-speed presses, a big development in the late 19th century. The new availability of cheap paper, the new linotype machine. Photography itself was pretty new, and photo engraving technologies, not to mention the phonograph, and the new possibilities for sound recording. All of these things kind of coming all at once. And some people got very excited about it, and others got pretty scared by it. National magazines caught on, distributed through a new national railroad system, and soon afterward by the new automobile, and then even early aircraft. In one lifetime, a lot of change had come about, and it even made possible, if you'll forgive me for mentioning it, even before the First World War, the existence of a border-crossing international newspaper that started in 1887. And Eiffel Tower was only half built, as we always say. And it started because its owner, a man named James Gordon Bennett, had seized on the invention of the telegraph, invested heavily in the transatlantic cable system, and had a way to connect his New York newspaper with a new Paris counterpart. The New York paper, of course, was the New York Herald Tribune. And that's a subject I could expand on other times, perhaps with some help from colleagues from the old IHT. And then along comes Marconi, and he's named this thing called radio broadcasting, and then moving pictures, as Teddy Roosevelt discovered. And this potential for pitiless publicity or propaganda became a huge new worry. I went to Northwestern as an undergrad. I taught there later for 13 years. My brother went there, my son went there, and I find myself citing Northwestern scholars a lot, and maybe it's a bias that makes me pick up what they write and read, but others have said this too. A book last year by Robert Gordon argued that the dislocating changes of that moment in just 3 or so decades were actually greater than they have been since that time. We think we live in a changing world. Well, you add up all those changes I've referred to, and maybe more daily life was changing even more. Gordon mentions a thing I didn't mention yet, electricity. Pure fact of electricity, and with it, street railroads, and indoor lighting, electric lighting, and outdoor lighting, and indoor plumbing, he adds to the list. And the elevator, all these things had really changed the way people lived. And this was part of the disconcerting new world that people were trying to figure out. A more significant change for more people in that period than any other time in human history, says Gordon. We could argue about the quantity of that, but it seems like a point worth noting. And the cult of propaganda became one of the products of all that upheaval. There's another journalist in our own time who has described how international flows of money, ideas, trade, credit, human beings have created what he termed globalization. He popularized that word, globalization, which is the first word in the title of this well-named book, Reflections on Globalization, Democracy, and the Media. It's not exactly a catchy, sexy title, but it's sort of what the book's about. And globalization, Thomas Friedman is the person I'm talking about, has made some huge changes in the way we view the world. But Friedman points out that he thinks the first great age of globalization was this very period at the beginning of the 20th century, when all of these measures of global flows accelerated relative to GNP at a faster pace than they even have in the last 20 or 30 years. So globalization is one of the actors in this drama. And this brought around this new way of thinking about public affairs. The second argument, not about social distension, has more to do with the individual human being, and I call that chapter the discovery of human unreason. How the average human being is capable of irrational behavior for all sorts of reasons, the depths of emotional motivation, and even hidden unconscious desires and fears can really change how people think. Human nature itself can go out of control, not just society. And we can behave in irrational ways. And people knew this all through history. But the awareness was really heightened in the 19th century, I think in part, as Lincoln mentioned, by the French Revolution and the excesses of the reign of terror and the unhappiness after the French Revolution, which seemed to prove, through Napoleon's example, that an excess of democracy can give rise to authoritarian leadership, even if you don't call it tyranny. And there were a lot of books about this. The French writer Le Bon, who some know more about than I do, wrote a book on the crowd mentality, passions of the beast, the mob. All these terms were around. A British scholar described it as a herd mentality, where people in a group lose some of their individual capacity for sensibility. And this intellectual movement took on a kind of popular version. Beginning in the 1880s, 1890s, I would say. Even in the schoolyards of America anyway, kids were falling in love with hypnotism. It became a huge cult. The power of the hypnotist. And I even remember this in my childhood, in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. A friend coming over and saying, "You know how to hypnotize people? I just read this book." And there were pamphlets around, most of them from the 19th century, about how to hypnotize people, how to control your neighbor. And of course, that seemed like magic, new, exciting power, especially teenage kids. There's one story I have to tell, and I'll read it from the book in part. It's a favorite story, and it's kind of a metaphor for this new appreciation of what I call unreason. And let's see if I get the right page quickly. It was a novel written by a man named Gerard du Maurier. He was British, actually, French-sounding name. And it was called Trilby. Have any of you heard about the Trilby craze? Back in the 1890s. It became the best-selling book up to that point in American history. It was everywhere. And it told the story of Trilby. I'll try to read this. A naturalistic, beautiful, pure, uneducated, blonde, of course, Occidental. And there was a man named Svengali, who was a hypnotist. and he could exert dark power over people, and his victim in this case was Trilby. He transformed her into a great concert singer, even as he destroyed her own will and replaced it with his. His hypnotic power, it must be remembered, was assumed by many readers to be based on science. This was the new science of the unconscious and the power of suggestion. Here's the text from the book. With a single word, Svengali could turn Trilby into an unconscious beauty of marble who could produce wonderful sounds, just the sounds he wanted, and could think his thoughts and wish his wishes, and love him at his bidding with a strange, unreal love, just his own love for himself turned inside out. That can explain a lot of things in some cases. He mesmerized her. And these are the words of Lair, Trilby's friend, who kind of lost her when she came under Svengali's spell. He mesmerized you. That's what it is, mesmerism. I've often heard of it, but never seen it done before. They get into you, and they get you into their power, and they make you do any blessed thing they please, like murder, steal, anything. It's just too terrible to think of. Excited and impressionable youngsters across America would soon be repeating the mesmerist's famous words again and again in backyard conversations. And you shall see nothing, hear nothing, think of nothing, but Svengali, Svengali, Svengali. And that kind of expressed a popular mood. Some people thought there was some scientific base to all this, but a lot of people made a lot of people uneasy that maybe these masters of the media can play a Svengali like trick on you. I like that story just because it kind of sums up this moment, this mood. It appeared in other ways too. Here's another Northwestern University professor, this time writing in 1904. His name was Walter Dill Scott. He's a professor of psychology, this new science of psychology at Northwestern. And he wrote a book that year called The Psychology of Advertising. And it became a big hit. And people who were, advertising industry was just beginning to gain some strength. Sent it all out in Chicago at first. Scott was nearby at Northwestern. He became a godlike figure to a lot of these new advertising people who suddenly realized that advertising was not just a matter of booking space and bartering rates, but was creating messages that had psychological impact. One of the big names that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about was Albert Lasker, Chicago-based advertiser. And he fixed on the phrase, we must learn how to do salesmanship in print. And a lot of this had to do with this new art, the new arts of psychology. I must tell you, he later became president of Northwestern University, and both as a student and a professor there, I often would meet and dine in Walter Dill Scott Hall, named after this person without fully realizing the role he had had in this whole new way of looking at information. Well, a cult of hypnotism helped give this an intellectual boost, but there was another force, and you're probably thinking of it. The big new name that came along just at this time, and that even though they didn't read him, everybody knew his name, was of course Sigmund Freud. And Freud detailed a lot of why the leader, the father figure, could exercise irrational control over the masses who might follow him. And the unconscious, power of tapping the unconscious and being able to maybe heal it, as Freud would say, for a lot of people meant you could manipulate it. You could use these hidden powers to accomplish unhappy goals. There's another German scholar, not Hitler this time, but Goethe, whose maxim was, and I've got to try my German here, du glaubst geschieben, doch wird geschoben. You think you are pushing, but in fact you're being shoved. And that kind of summed up what a lot of people thought maybe was going on then and now. The book ends with quick little portraits, well, not so little, but 5 chapters on 5 people who I found it terribly interesting to read about and to write about. And each one is a story we could spend some time telling, but I'm now checking in on where we stand in terms of time. The first one had the interesting name of Ivy Lee. He is considered to be the founder of the public relations industry. If there's a textbook on public relations being used, at least in the United States, often it'll have a preface or a chapter about how all this got started, and people will say that Ivy Lee was the founder of the public relations industry, profession, whatever word you want to use. He was a Princeton grad, an elite socialite, suave, polished, in love with aristocratic trappings of New York social life. And he described himself as a counselor to big business. He was one of these people who really tried to sell the business community on the new arts of publicity. Somebody said he ministered to the confusions of the establishment by saying, look, you can straighten this all out by being transparent, by telling the truth, or some version of the truth, sharing what you think is your message with more people. And he hoped to introduce this thought that the public relations executive held the answer to a lot of people's ambitions. He was the central figure in changing the image of the Rockefeller family from one of corporate predators to fairly decent, maybe even philanthropic leaders, and worked for the Rockefellers for 30 or 40 years, but for a lot of other people as well. Now, would Ivy Lee say that he was manipulating the public? Heavens no. He sold all this by saying this is how you make democracy work. And it's interesting the rationalizations that people come up with. Just very quickly, maybe the voice of the people was the voice of God, even though he was necessary to letting that voice be heard by endorsing whatever he was advancing. And you still could say this was making democracy work because the people in the end could decide whether it was true or false. And if they decided to believe you, that meant it was true, because the people really in the end weren't going to go wrong. That's real rationalization, but with Ivy Lee it worked. And it helped strengthen a lot of other people's faith that publicity could be a positive answer for that very reason. One of those other people was a reformer, an idealist, the second person I read about, named George Creel, a less well-known name today, although he should be remembered more this year because Woodrow Wilson was said to have run the First World War through three people: the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, and George Creel. Creel, this reformer, exuberant, passionate, very religious, very idealistic, really loved Woodrow Wilson. Wilson himself, as a child, would practice giving orations because Wilson believed in the power of the spoken word. This is off the subject, but Wilson, when he became president, he was the first one since Jefferson to actually deliver the State of the Union message in person because he thought the voice of the leader had to be heard directly. Teddy Roosevelt said, I wish I had thought of that. Roosevelt never did. But that shows this common orientation. Anyway, Creel was then invited by Wilson in 1917, right after the declaration of war, to come to Washington to find space for a new organization. The young Army lieutenant who showed him around on this tour of Washington was Douglas MacArthur, of all people. Tiny little fact that means nothing to anything, but it's sort of fun to stumble upon these things. And Creel's job was to set up the biggest propaganda machine in the history of the United States, or even since, I think. And I'll read a little bit about just what he accomplished. It was a machine to stir up what Creel called white-hot war fever. And this in a country that in November, this is April, the previous November had elected Wilson on the slogan, he kept us out of war. This was an isolationist country that had built its whole identity around being free of European squabbles and politics and warfare. And within days and weeks, Wilson, with Creel as his great megaphone, at least for a while, turned public opinion around on that question. He built this mammoth machine. We were in the war only 18 months, but boy did he get it going in a powerful way. And here's just a little tiny detail on how that happened. There was the most gigantic proposition for the powers of publicity in American history. In just 18 months, this group was not called the propaganda machine. Creel was a good enough propagandist to call it by a name that etched its way into every mind in the United States at the time. It was the Committee on Public Information. They raised $7 million. The output of books and pamphlets alone in that time exceeded 75 million. My favorite part of this, 75,000 people became known as 4 Minutemen. And what did they do? They spoke for 4 minutes and when? at the first intermission after 8 o'clock in theaters all over the country. People were going to theaters and to the movies, and it was broadcasting before radio because these leaders, these 4 Minutemen, get up, give a 4-minute speech written in Washington, sent to them, and they finally involved theaters in 5,200 communities around the United States. Every evening, just after 8 o'clock, the 4 Minutemen would be there to deliver this message. It's just a little example of the planning and the detail and the passion that went into this, the energy. And he also then created divisions for making films, posters, ads, cartoons, articles, and photographs. Special agents looked after labor, the foreign-born, women had their own division, wireless and undersea cable, and separate offices for a variety of press relations. As a result, Creel proudly declared after the war was over, there is not a single corner of the earth or the country today that does not know us as we truly are. And knowing us, they like us and trusted us. And that was his statement of what he accomplished in a pretty amazingly short period of time. Let's see, there's one other quote he liked to use. He wrote a book about this in 1920 called How We Advertised America, and the power that unit had to really formulate public opinion that really hadn't been there before. Here's what he quoted a poet writing about this all, and they enlisted a lot of poets and artists in this effort. But now as I study that row upon row of windblown engravings, I feel satisfaction deep down in my star-spangled heart, for I know how art put on khaki and went into action. And that's a pretty good metaphor. The whole country, in a sense, became militarized. Art and everything else put on khaki and went into action because of the power of this propaganda machine. At least Creel liked to think that. Wrapping up, that's the second of the 5 figures I was going to mention. I will say one more word about Creel's committee because it's so central to all of this. It involved people from every walk of life. University personnel, including the high-placed executives and the huge chunk of the professorial corps signed up with the CPI. I think they employed about 50,000 people, either as volunteers or as direct employees by the time they were done. People from every walk of life, as I said, and the big thing that happened afterward is that, as somebody said, you could walk down Madison Avenue in New York and go into any ad agency, and it tended to be headed by somebody who'd been trained by the Creel Committee on Public Information. Public relations and advertising industries were really shaped by the experience of a lot of these people in World War I. And that's a story worth paying attention to, too. How did Creel justify this? Was he manipulating the masses in undemocratic ways? No. Maybe the voice of the people wasn't the voice of God. He said, but he thought the voice of Woodrow Wilson was the voice of God. He really liked Wilson, obviously. And Wilson may have thought this. We just saw him as like a religious prophet. And if Wilson said it, that was the voice of the people speaking. So that's how he rationalized some of this. Enough for Creel. Except to say one thing. America wanted to stay out of the war to protect democracy. And this was an old value that had a lot of value and power and called for America to behave exceptionally. Wilson quickly grew on those same values. But of course, he said the war is the way we're going to make the world safe for democracy. He was still calling on that religious value. People called him, Creel called him the Archangel Woodrow, kind of a religious leader who could bring the public along. Well, all of this collapsed with the end of the war. Wilson himself collapsed physically, his stroke as he tried to sell the League of Nations. Bad things happened in Europe, in Russia, in Germany, and the disillusion really set in. A common description was under the headline, I remember in one magazine, "They all lied." We were all lied to. And even a lot of the people who participated began to get very confessional and to say, we all lied. And one of the groups made a pact on the last day of the war that they would never lie to anyone about anything again. They were feeling pretty guilty about this whole process. One of the people who felt that guilt, because he had been part of the CPI, was Walter Lippmann, and he's sort of my favorite philosopher, and I'll just talk about him a little, and then I'll mention quickly the last two people on the list. Lippmann had been a star Harvard student at a very young age. He became a socialist. He was the leader of the Socialist Club. He believed in reform and the power of the people, well organized, and he lost that confidence completely during this period. He actually worked for Wilson. He helped to drop the 14 points that Wilson took to Versailles. He became one of the early editors of the New Republic, and he worked for the CPI for a while. And then his disillusion really set in. He had written a book called Drift and Mastery. It's an important book in 1914 or 15, in which he saw the world drifting. But he said we can still exercise some mastery and control, and the masters must be the leading elites, the scientists, the scientific, knowledgeable elites. And he brought that view forward later on. What got worse and worse for him is that he couldn't quite believe the scientific elites could do it. And more than that, he thought that things were slipping even further out of the control of the public, that the public was behaving even more badly. And then what happened? In the summer of 1920, out of the smoke-filled rooms, Chicago being one of the cities, came two people who were widely described as pretty mediocre candidates for the presidency. They were not T.R., Roosevelt. They were not Woodrow Wilson. One was James Cox, who had been a newspaper publisher in Ohio, interestingly, and then public office holder there. And the other, of course, was Warren Harding. And when Harding was nominated, our old friend H.L. Mencken had a comment, probably heard echoed for some reason more recently. Mencken says, well, look, if the presidency reflects the will of the people, then one fine day the plain fools of this land will reach their heart's desire, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron. That's 1920. And Lippmann shared in that fear, and when Harding was elected, he wrote an article called, in one of the popular magazines, I've got to find the quote, just got to share this. It's toward the end of the book, I think. And here it is. It's actually, goes back to ancient Greece. It's the Iliad of Homer. And this is the quote Lippmann used. Enlighten me now, O muses, tenants of Olympian homes, for you are goddesses. You are inside on everything. You know everything. But we poor mortals hear only the news and know nothing at all. And that's, I think, the way a lot of people felt then and maybe now. And that's kind of a sobering dose of realism for journalism students who fear it might be true, but it's also, I find journalism students, some people agree or disagree, feeling a higher sense of calling, at least in my classes. They talk about the mission. This is a good time to go into journalism because the mission is so important and so much more challenging. Skip to the last couple pages here and then we'll be done. Lippmann's reaction to all of this was not expressed only in writing, but in action. He decided to leave New York, quit the magazine business. Where did he move? At the farthest out end of Long Island, a place called Wading River, very near, in fact, where we go in the summers to Shelter Island, New York, you know. And while he was there, he spent 18 months writing a book I think ranks with the Federalist Papers as perhaps the most important work of American political philosophy. A lot of people disagree with this, but it was called Public Opinion, 1922. And in brief in that book, he says simply, look, and this is so kind of refreshing, don't blame the public for all of this. They're not bad people. They're not all that stupid. It's just that they're busy. They're preoccupied. They're focusing on their own lives, their own jobs. They're overwhelmed with too much information. You can't expect people to sort all of this out in this big, complicated world. They're controlled by certain pictures in their heads, what he calls stereotypes. And that's one reason that propagandists can run wild sometimes, because people don't know enough to defend themselves. So the answer, effectively, is to go back to Plato. Depend on wise elites to govern us, give power to the scientific-minded leaders, and chief among them, he thinks, is the new expert trained journalist. And this was a period when journalism schools began to grow up all over the country. And it will be their job, he says, to protect democracy from the masses. To protect democracy from the masses. He diagnoses the problem, but I don't think his answer was all that persuasive. Real quickly, I'll talk about the fourth figure who really loved the book Public Opinion. His name was John Dewey. I read about him. His answer wasn't so much Lippmann's scientific elites, although it included that, but rather getting at people young enough in life through progressive education to train them to be good citizens thinking for themselves later on. And you don't depend on the remote experts, you count on the teacher, you begin with the child, and you adapt your education to the inner soul of the student so they will learn to trust you and grow up in a proper frame of mind. It sounds great. As you read it, it's more and more elitist and controlling. The teacher has an agenda. You want the child to follow your lead. Can I read one more thing? Do we have like 5 more minutes? This is a quote that sums this all up and ties a couple of things together on page 258 and 9. One of the progressive educators who's still very popular was Maria Montessori, one of Montessori schools following this. And in a group of educators today, I just thought I had to share this. Montessori says, to stimulate life, you have to leave the student free to develop, to unfold. Then when the teacher shall have touched the child, however, soul for soul, each one of her pupils awaking and inspiring the life within them, she will then possess their soul, as she possesses. And a sign, a single word from her shall suffice, and each one will feel her in a living and vital way. Now listen, the teacher says, a soft voice is going to call your name. And then in the room behind the children, she will whisper, lingering over the syllables, almost occult-like, reaching the heart and calling of the soul of each child. And each one, as he is called, will lift his head and open his eyes as if altogether happy, and then rise silently. I write, it's nothing less than Svengali all over again. Svengali shall hear nothing. Well, that probably is an exaggeration, but there was in the progressive education movement and in other progressive movements of that era a kind of controlling hope that the arts of publicity could be used to make people learn about their own self-interest. So that was John Dewey and the fourth figure. There's one last one, just so you know about it. His name was Edward Bernays. He was Ivy League successor as the leader of the public relations industry. And he was a very thoughtful, erudite man. He sold everything. He sold Lucky Strike cigarettes by convincing women that they ought to be smoking, whole new audience. It was the lamp of freedom, of liberation, was a cigarette. This was Bernays' doing. He got the art galleries around New York to feature green as the color of the year, because the Lucky Strike package was in green and you would be attracted to it. It wasn't, pretty smart public relation. He told Thomas Masaryk when he wanted to declare Czechoslovakian independence just before the First World War, Mr. Masaryk, you have to announce this on a Sunday so the cables will be able to distribute it. And Masaryk said, but we can't make history for the cables. And Bernays said, it's the cables that make history. And he was really proud of that and known for it. That kind of sums up this whole message. Bernays, well, also part of the Committee on Public Information. He really liked Lippmann's book. He wrote books like it. And I'll just skip to the end here. Most of all, he sold the public relations industry, and he sold himself as a genius who could bring about this huge post-war transformation in American life by making public relations the leaders and guiders of the country. He didn't quite succeed in that. Somebody said he attracted a lot of people who were lesser men than he was, but he had this great idea that maybe the PR industry could be a profession like medicine or law, where you would have entrance exams and a code of ethics, and these people could morally use these powers to do good things. And he had a lot of clients who were on the liberal side of social life and of government and politics. Time magazine described him as U.S. publicist #1. And he was very proud of that. How did he sell himself? I just have to mention another time, excuse me. These things all sort of flow together. He was Freud's nephew. He was Freud's nephew twice over. His mother was Freud's sister, and Freud's wife was Bernays' wife, sister. So it's like the two Freuds married the two Bernays', and then their son, Edward, became the, and he made the most of Freudian psychology and how he knew all the tricks, and Freud really liked his books. He had to find a book to, again, this is how you rationalize what you're doing to public opinion. How does it seem to be justified morally and democratically? And Bernays thought it was really important to find the right word to describe all this. For a while, he tried to use the word propaganda and turn it into a good word, and it didn't work. I interviewed him in 1968, I guess, and he said, boy, did I drop that word quickly once I realized what people thought it meant. He became the model in the 1930s for Sinclair Lewis's novel, It Can't Happen Here, the public relations genius who brought this fascist power based on the Huey Long example. He was a whipping boy for the industry, but he also was a big advocate for a more moral approach to the industry. And he died just 12 years ago at age 103. And I talk about him a little bit because I end the book really with his, with something that was in his book. The word he finally found to express the right blend of control with democratic freedom was crystallizing public opinion. And that was the book Freud liked so much. You crystallize something. It was there already. The shape was inherent in it. You didn't invent it or manufacture it or impose it. You merely crystallized it. And that was the kind of word he was looking for. Then he decided maybe that was too soft. And the word he finally ended up with over his long, long life was engineering public opinion. All the variables were there. The engineer could come in and do that job. And what's to protect you then from a bad engineer? Well, maybe there's some inherent sense in whatever your raw materials are working with us. But how do you protect against the abuses of the engineers of consent? And Bernays finally concludes that the answer lies in the conscience of the engineer, the conscience of the public relations executive, and that's why he believed in this new set of professional standards and pushed it and pushed it and pushed it, never very successfully, but passionately. I'll tell this really quickly and informally and forget about my notes. About the time I visited with him, and I did a long set of interviews that got into the book, even though they were way back then, he began his autobiography, 1,000 pages, telling wonderful stories of all his conquests through the years. And can you hear me? Is the mic working? He began the book with a quotation from Milton. As authors do, you find a little quotation that sums up your theme. And the quotation was something like, "Let us never forget the counsels of the wisest men, that to the public good, private respects must yield." So I decided to go home to my dorm in Harvard and look up the Milton quote. And it comes from the story from the Bible, Samson and Delilah. Except it has a completely opposite meaning. It's what Delilah says to Samson after she's blinded him, or is blinded by his enemies. She's shorn him of his hair and his power. And she said, "But the wisest men told me that to the public good, private respects must yield." And I listened to them, and sorry about that. And Samson says something awful about her. And the way I end this book, but I'll end the talk with one more quotation, just to warn you that this isn't quite the end. The way I end this book is by saying that this grounded maxim, so rife and celebrated by all, is that to the public good, private respects must yield. And then, better than most, I've decided to write, Edward Bernays understood the dynamics of this new age of distension, and public unreason, and the potential for organized publicity. All his life, he had tried to envisage these potentials as yielding to the public good. But hard reality kept bursting through. And even as he completed his autobiography in his 74th year, the words he chose to epitomize the respectability of his creed and the craft he served also served to demonstrate their inescapable dangers. I told Bernays what I had found out about this quote, and he said, well, I got it from the Oxford Book of Quotations. Okay, well, I guess that happens, but it does illustrate this dilemma, this tension. I could end on that note as I did the book, but I thought that's a little too unhappy and problematic. So I have one last quote to read, and it's pretty striking. I promise this is the end. Be very patient. Lippmann finishes this book on public opinion, which is pretty devastating. The public's just not up to this, and let's see if maybe wise leaders can do it, but it's not as if he's convinced. And he realizes he's leaving people in a pretty uncertain state. So as I understand it, he tacks onto the book a little coda in which he says, we must do the work of reason, but we can do it better if we don't allow our frightfulness and fanaticism to impress us so deeply that we just throw up our hands. We cannot let it to allow us to lose faith in the future of human beings. There's really no ground for this despair because all of human history is always pregnant with the future. So as you can say, and I think this is probably good advice to all of us as we try to cope with unprecedented things. It is no judgment, only a mood when people deny that some of them have been, more of them might ultimately be. You can despair of what has never been, but you cannot despair of the possibilities that could exist by virtue of any human quality which you've seen in your lifetime. And if, amidst all the evils of this decade, you have not seen men and women and known moments that you would like to multiply, well then the Lord himself cannot help you. And that's where he leaves it, and maybe that's what I'll be tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, for that extraordinary tour of practically the entire 20th century. I mean, it was an amazing reach. Anyway, I'm going to suggest, since the hour is incredibly late and we are on a very tight schedule, that since the trustees will get an opportunity